I don't usually take the privilege of standing here to introduce our speakers to make a political statement. But today I'm going to make one. What happened in Las Vegas late last night brought to my mind the Trump slogan, "Make America Great Again." And I felt what we really need to do is to make America safe again. And if you remember, that very idea, make America great again, was infused with violence. Make America great again by building a wall with Mexico. Make America great again by suspecting every refugee or migrant of being a terrorist or connected with a terrorist organization. Make America great again by blowing up this, that, or the other part of the world. I think if we could focus the unfocusable mind of many of the leaders in this country, Trump at the head of them, to just try and make America safe again, to make America safe in the way in which Black Lives Matter has talked about making America safe, to make America safe by re-examining the gun laws and seeing the deadly destiny that year after year emanates from the misuse of guns. To make America safe again by not attributing violence to the Constitution and the Second Amendment. I would like us to think of this slogan, make America safe again, and I request you to hold a short silence for those who are once again a victim to a very important form of misgovernance and abuse in this country. Thank you very much. This evening's event is the first in a 3-year series at the Mahindra Center, supported by the Mellon Foundation on Migration and the Humanities. And I can't imagine a better way to inaugurate this project than a conversation with Bouchra Khalili and Glenn Lowry. Bouchra Khalili is a Moroccan-French visual artist working with film, video, installation, photography, and prints. Khalili's practice articulates language, subjectivity, orality, and geographical explorations. She often retools the aesthetic strategies of documentary cinema to focus on historical speculations and the representations of subjects rendered invisible by the nation-state. Amongst her recent solo exhibitions are Living Labor at the Wexner Center for the Arts in 2017, the Mapping Journey Project at MoMA in 2016, Foreign Office at the Palais de Tokyo, Paris in 2015, and Garden Conversation at MCBA, Barcelona in 2015. She's a professor of contemporary art at Oslo National University and a founding member of La Cinémathèque de Tanger, an artist-run not-for-profit organization dedicated to promoting and developing film culture in North Africa. This year, she's the David and Roberta Logie Fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies. Glenn D. Lowry became the 6th director of the Museum of Modern Art in 1995. His major initiatives include the creation of a new curatorial department, Media and Performance Art, in 2009, the establishment of the Contemporary and Modern Art Perspective in a Global Age initiative, CMAP, from which I learned a great deal and for which I thank you. Some of the best times I've had were at the CMAP seminars, a research program for the exchange of knowledge and ideas, and the successful merger of the Museum of Modern Art and PS1 Contemporary Art Center in 1999, all of which support the contemporary global work that he and the museum have long championed. Lowry lectures and writes in support of contemporary art, on the role of the museum in society, and on other topics related to his research interests, including Islamic art. In fact, got his degree in Islamic art, his doctorate from Harvard. Glenn's current book project, which is fascinating, I have some insider knowledge of it, is In Between Places, and it explores the contemporary Middle Eastern art and is premised, and I quote, on the idea that the Middle East needs to be expanded to include large parts of Europe now inhabited by sizable populations of first and second generation immigrants from the Middle East. The current refugee crisis in Europe and the Middle East has made it clear that migration plays as critical a role in the moral imagination of the humanities as it does in shaping the activist vision of humanitarianism and human rights. Humanitarian intervention initiates urgent political arrangements necessary for the rescue and refuge of populations in extremis. Human rights laws protect the dignity and security of migrants by protecting them, integrating them into a just society with provisions for pursuing the good life. What is the role of the humanities in the bare life of migration? Too often, the humanities are summoned merely as witnesses to the spectacle and the crises of the urgency of existence. Their aesthetic and moral value is attributed to the powers of empathy they evoke. Yet the intellectual formation of the humanities, their very focus on language, their very interest in the nature of the making of meaning, in the construction of symbols and culture, in the production of knowledge, and in the setting out of normative and moral ideas, is deeply resonant with the displacement of values, the revision of norms, the problems of settlement and belonging that are all a part of the narrative of migrant lives. Bouchra Khalili's remarkable work brings to mind for me Hannah Arendt's concept of what she calls the everywhereness of the stateless, caught in the barbed wire labyrinth of those denied rights and representations. The stateless and minorities, Arendt writes of Europe in the interwar years, are nothing less than the emergence of a new constituency in contemporary politics. Without the representation or protection of governments, they are forced to live under the law of exception, and those whom the persecutor had singled out as scum of the earth actually were received as scum of the earth everywhere. The tragic reality of large numbers of migrants and refugees is in our time cynically used to violate ethical norms of hospitality and vitiate legal provisions for refugee and asylum. Only too soon, those who are struggling to survive statelessness are seen as a threat to national security, a clear and present danger to civilization as we know it. And in defense of civilization, societies that proclaim themselves to be pioneers of the rights of man and citizens turn into barbarians that build walls and camps and close borders. Pertinently in her time, and presciently for ours, Arendt characterizes the governmentality of refugee or stateless populations as a police-directed foreign policy, exercising unrestricted and arbitrary domination, a dark misrule of law, within the ever-moving domain of the barbed wire labyrinth. What gives Arendt's concepts of mere existence or the barbed wire labyrinth their modular and derivative powers of expression is reflected in her account of what it means to think. The foundation of the freedom of thought, the idea of the thought itself, she says, is imbued with the right to movement. Arendt puts it beautifully, of all the specific liberties which may come into our minds when we hear the word freedom, freedom of movement is historically the oldest and also the most elementary. Without the freedom of movement, you only have enslavement. Both action and thought occur in the form of movement, and therefore freedom underlies both freedom of movement and freedom of action, and freedom, indeed I would add, of aesthetic and ethical production. Thank you very much for being here today, and I greatly look forward to your questions and your participation in our event. Thank you. Good evening, Bouchra. Good evening, Glenn. Thank you for being here. It's a great honor, but more than an honor, it's a great pleasure. And I think we should go for pleasure.
Thank you, Homi.
So, Bouchra, I thought we might start with you saying a few words about the work that you're showing today more generally. And then we can move on to looking at some clips. Then I have Glenn coming in, we have a discussion, and we get to the next etape. So, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this invitation. I'm extremely honored to have this conversation with you and with you, Glenn. Can you hear me? Because I'm not used to speak very loud, so if you don't hear me, just... Okay.
Yeah, that's really important. Everybody has to hear Bouchra.
Yeah.
So.
So for this conversation, we started discussing what works should we focus on among the numerous projects I have produced. So for today, we will be mostly discussing two projects, one called the Mapping Journey Project, produced between 2008 and 2011, and the other called the Speeches Series, produced between 2012 and 2013. As you can hear, many of my projects are built around different works that are combined together in order to form larger body of works. It's actually part of my process. And those two works were also existing as projects years before I could eventually produce them. And I would say that all of my projects somehow existed before I produced them and even before I became an artist, because somehow they are rooted in my own position as an artist, a citizen, someone who was born and raised in Morocco and then later went to Europe to get an education. So they are somehow part of my own experiences, or I should say, part of my own experience as a witness, and as well embodying maybe the position of the witness as well. The Mapping Journey project is composed of 8 different videos, forming a video installation, as well as 8 silkscreen prints. And the project started somehow as a natural continuation of the works I was producing since I graduated in 2002. And I decided to actually focus on this very specific counter-geography that forced illegal journeys somehow produce. And I came almost naturally to start reflecting on this as someone who was a teenager in Morocco in the early 90s and who as well witnessed the direct consequence of the Schengen Agreement that was discussed and then eventually signed among the countries that were members of the European Union, that were actually a promise of free mobility, to go back to your beautiful presentation. The idea was basically that European Union would also guarantee to the European citizens the right to mobility within the European Union. But the consequence of this for the neighboring countries, and mostly for the North African countries, was that suddenly the borders of Europe were closed to us. before 91, it was actually quite easy to go to Spain. And as a kid, I used to spend the holidays in Spain. It was not far. It was only 14 kilometers away from Tangiers. I'm from Casablanca, but it was quite easy to go to Tangiers, take the boat, cross the Strait of Gibraltar. 42 hours after, you would be in Spain, and you could spend time there and then go back to your country. But suddenly in 91, we had to apply for visas, and that was new. As if the promise of free mobility for specific citizens were automatically a synonym of denial for others who were not members of that exclusive group or that VIP group made of citizens who are legitimate to move freely. So this was a major event in North Africa that was mostly silenced, I must say, in Europe, and even in North African countries for many years. But it was immediately noticed among the population to the point that it even produced a sort of counterculture made of narrative, tales, stories, jokes, songs. As an example, maybe some of you who are familiar with North African music know a very specific genre called Rai. Rai is Sha'bi music, popular music, pop music. And most of the songs are actually address this question of going to Europe, being able to go to Europe, because it became a sort of collective obsession to suddenly, because the borders were closed, there was suddenly a need to go out. And this was immediately mirrored in a new form of culture in North Africa. And of course, I was a witness of this as a North African myself. So when I became an artist, of course, I went back to those stories. And I went back to what I witnessed as a Moroccan. Also, as well, trying to approach, I would say, this question from another perspective, because when I went to the West, the question of migration was often discussed and often reduced to how many of them can we host? Speaking of it in terms of numbers, are we getting the good ones? And it was often discussed this way. But what was never discussed is that this need to go out was often linked to the political situation in North African countries as well. The point is that in Morocco or in Algeria, as example, the reason why so many young men, and soon after many young women, were ready to risk their life crossing the Strait of Gibraltar is because they were not living in democracies. They were also living in authoritarian regimes that didn't offer them any other alternative than to live, to be able to be free. So the question of free mobility was also about the question of democracy and to be eventually recognized as a citizen, coming from a country that do not recognize you as a citizen. When I was a teenager in Morocco, I was still the subject of a king. I was not a Moroccan citizen. And that also is something that very much influenced my own way of approaching this question. So from the moment I accepted the idea that I would become an artist, which was not an easy decision to make, I must say.
Why?
Because often when, there is this idea that artists are born artists by vocation, and they are mysteriously called to fulfill that vocation, but sometimes you have to fight with it, because it's not an easy decision to make. Because if you want to engage with it, you know that it also engages your life in a way, because this is what you will be doing. And if you do it, you have to do it right, and you have to be fully committed to it. So it's a responsibility. You really have to think of it in depth. I could have become an academic, but for the desperation of my parents, I made eventually the decision to become an artist. So that's how it happened.
So you're going to, do you think this is the moment where we can see the two clips, or do you want to, and then, should we do that?
Yeah, and then I can maybe give more details on the project.
So do our friends know what you want to show? So Bouchra, I'm going to return to you to describe this project in a moment, but I do want to first just go to Glenn, who's actually writing about this work and works such as...
Well, I'm endlessly fascinated by this particular project because I think it raises so many issues, and each time I see it, I think about something different. So while I'm sure we'll get into the whole notion of the way in which these individuals map new territory, what I was thinking about as I was watching it now, or at least these two of the 8 journeys, and I want to underscore how different each of these journeys is, in fact, that there's, just as they map an invisible kind of space, I think they also articulate a different kind of time. And that the time of the, and use migrant here in quotation marks, the time of the individual on the move outside the legal framework of visas and passports operates differently. Back and forth, 2 weeks here, endless moments waiting for a job over there, that somehow the notion of temporality that is so central to our own lives is deflected and distorted as well once one enters into these realms of movement that go outside our normal frame of reference. So I was just thinking about how time operates here, and the way in which these journeys can take years, right? What might be a 2-hour plane ride for the rest of us becomes a multi-year exercise with all sorts of returns and departures, and what doesn't come through in these 2 journeys, time spent in jail, being returned to one's homeland, leaving again. So I wondered if this issue of temporality was something that you thought about.
Absolutely. As I was telling before, I was a witness, but I was also a listener of those stories. So when I was in Morocco, that's also what I heard, that it can take years before you can finally settle. And in between, you have to live a life. And you have to live a life that can be also a life of your own. So you always have to adapt and define a new way to find the place where you can finally stay, work, make a living, make a life of your own. And this takes indeed time. So my challenge as an artist was also how to represent that very specific temporality. And that's also the reason why I eventually came up with this idea of using political maps of the world of Europe and the Mediterranean, because the map is this abstract representation of territory, but from the moment you give that map to someone who can use it as a sort of page on which his or her own story can be told, that story also embodies its own temporality. So for me, the map was as much a sort of factual representation of borders as defined by nation states and how they define their own limits, as much as a page on which a counter geography could be defined, but also a page on which a narrative could be written. And what was as well quite important for me is to turn it into a sort of tool for resistance. How can you resist this so-called objective and factual image of territory and challenging it, as well as challenging the notion of nation-state through very singular trajectories with their own geography, their own temporality, that could be drawn as much as told, including with a permanent marker, so it cannot be erased anymore. That very specific trajectory and that very specific temporality cannot be erased anymore from that very specific map. It will remain there. So it was a different, or I should say, a combination of different layers that I tried to articulate all together to reflect as much as on the idea of what is a territory, how do you approach a territory, How do you cross territories where you were not given the possibility to do it freely? Because you have to do it differently. You have to invent a way that can be extremely dangerous, that can even kill yourself. But also, how can you produce a representation of that very specific temporality that goes with the experience of forced exile or forced illegal journeys? Because as you were saying, it can take years. And in mapping journey number 7, it actually took him 10 years. Now he eventually got legal papers in Spain, actually already a few years ago. It happened a few months after we met, actually.
So I want to just ask one more question, if I might, Homi, just to carry this line of thought about the marker. There's an interesting tension, it seems to me, between the emphatic permanent mark that each of these journey makers inscribes on that map and their anonymity, right? That what is left is the permanence of their mark, but we never really meet them. We don't see their face, we see their hand, and we hear their voice. And I wondered what was the thinking behind leaving the presence of the human, the visible presence of each of these people out, and yet at the same time insisting on the permanence of their presence through the inscribed mark?
Well, there are actually two reasons for that in my opinion don't contradict each other. The first one is that I have seen too many, and from the 90s as well, I have seen too many of those media reports capturing images of individuals forced to travel illegally in southern Spain, because we were seeing that, in Europe, but also in Morocco. And they were landing on those plastic boats that we used to call in Morocco pateras, those very small boats that are definitely not made for crossing even 14 kilometers at night. And those images for me were extremely violent because they were filmed beyond their will, finally arriving after a very dangerous trip, not even ask their permission, still traumatized by what they went through. And suddenly there were all those reporters waiting for them because they heard from the Red Cross or whatever that there was a boat landing soon. And they were filmed and exposed that way. And it's something that shocked me immensely.
So Bouchra, if I might just talk a little bit about the last thing you said, which is how as an artist could I represent this? And Glenn then takes up the question of time, not just the mapping of space, but of time. And I think that's a very productive line. And it seemed to me that although the marker is permanent, it is actually being drawn on maps where we know the European boundaries were often changing. There are moments of stability and instability. And the third element in the representation is the fluttering and wavering hand. So however much the marker puts a permanent mark, the way the hand moves in these works is a signifier of meaning. And I think that really catches this two things. One, the emphasis on transition, this continual unsettlement of transition, which I think is really important, particularly in many accounts of, if you talk about indentured labor in the 19th century, the last third of the 1850s onwards, if you talk about the Middle Passage, the transition is as much part of the narrative and the disruption of time. And I think you do it beautifully with the permanent marker, the image of the nation states and their frontiers, and then the hand, which is after all one of the figurative elements, metaphorical as well as indexical in this work. But just two other things. One, this notion of time, this fibrillating notion of time of transition, actually makes such an ironic point about the fact that if you want citizenship, you have to show that you've been settled for 5 years, for instance. You know, you've got to present your electricity bill, you've kept the same address. So I've written about this, actually, this very process. And in Joseph Cairns' new book on the ethics of migration, it's all about, he says, you know, these periods of time are actually arbitrary. He himself, you know, he said that they're the ethical notion of social life, of the construction of the refugee and the migrant, but they are arbitrary, 5 years or 7 years. He's very clear about that. Interestingly, here in this work, in these works in particular, I also see the way in which movement, the very right to movement, is a freedom. But what I don't see is the oppression that went before. Why? Or what about that? What about the things that make you run? The things you're running from, not the things that you're running towards.
Well, if you allow me to do so, I will finish answering Glenn's question about why they are not shown. But it's also a way to answer your question in a way. It's a video. So there is the space that they had to cross. There is that specific temporality, and there is the cinematic space and the cinematic temporality as well. Mm-hmm. As you were saying, and that's absolutely true, there is this form of deictic gesture.
Yeah.
And this relationship to metonymy and metaphor. Yeah. How through fragments and how with combining fragments, you can suggest a representation. But that representation is incomplete anyway, because it's also about the tension between the on-screen and the off-screen, what is shown and what is being kept out of the image, which doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It does exist, but it exists in the tension between the two spaces. So their presence is also a form of absence, but in that absence, there is paradoxically a chance to keep a sense of opacity that prevents them to be exposed easily, and that also allows them to keep for themselves what they want to keep for themselves. However, there are other videos in the series that obviously are about individuals who are flying from wars. But I didn't want to emphasize those different situations because it can also give the opportunity to the ones who like to interrogate reasons for what, speaking as an example for the specifics of an application for asylum as an example. You must have good reasons, and among the good reasons, there is you are fleeing a war. And as opposed to that, there is the category of the economical migrants. Mm. And I didn't want to enter into those differentiations because if there is something called a right to mobility, it must be a right to mobility to everyone. And it shouldn't be conditioned, to put it in simple words. So, of course, the situations are different, or let's say the reasons are all different, but they all experience the same thing, meaning being forced to travel illegally. Because for those who are fleeing a war, they are not given visa from where they are at that moment. So they have to cross illegally borders anyway to be able to apply. So I didn't see the point of emphasizing those different reasons, even if there are different reasons. But I just considered that no one lives without a good reason. If that answers your question.
No, I completely agree with you that I think that the use of the economic migrants, political migrants, refugees, this really is often manipulated by states to keep people out. And there I entirely agree. But the crossing of the first boundary, the crossing of the international boundary, is the very definition or part of the definition of what it means to be a refugee. So in that way, the first boundary is something that you have to cross, and there's it's legal to cross it. I was just interested in the question of the memory that accompanies these journeys, when you read accounts, it's always the memory of the past, the memory of what you're fleeing. And that's the only reason I asked about this particular presentation.
But there's also something interesting about the seventh journey, but it's true for other journeys, which is return. It isn't just that there's this exodus, this effort to find someplace else. There's also this, among several of the people who embarked on these journeys, a desire to come back, or at least a relocation, whether it's a temporary return or in some cases perhaps a permanent return. So our notion of the migrant gets very complicated by the fact that actually the migrant is both the immigrant and the emigrant, right? That in a way, I think you unpack for us how complex these lives are, whereas we tend to see them only through the media as very simple transits from a place of conflict to a place of safety, and I put that in quotation marks. And it makes me think even more about one of the journeys you didn't show, which some have argued is the key journey, the third journey, which is really in Palestine itself. And maybe you would talk about that for a moment and how that, in a way, becomes a mirror for some of these other
Do you want me to describe it?
Yes. Or I can try to describe it, but you'll do a much better job. No, you.
Well, you're right. It's at least when I produced it, for me, it was the key one. Because it's not about someone who is leaving his country and going to another country. It's about someone who lives in Ramallah, in the West Bank, who is not allowed to go to East Jerusalem to visit his girlfriend. Although East Jerusalem is, from the perspective of international law, part of the Palestinian Authority territories. So he actually has to cross borders illegally in order to visit his girlfriend. She could visit him in Ramallah, but he makes a point to going to East Jerusalem to see her. So for him, it's also about a gesture of resistance, even though he was never given a permit to go to East Jerusalem. So the reason why I indeed always considered that one as the key of the whole project, it is because he's not a migrant in the let's say, common definition of it. He is someone who is stateless and who is banned to attend a portion of his territory because it's under occupation. So through that one, you can indeed understand the connection that the project makes with the notion of the nation state and the borders and the question of citizenship as well. He lives somewhere, but he's not a citizen. He's not allowed to travel in another part of what maybe would become one day his state. But at the same time, it also mirrors this question of precariousness that one can see in the other videos, because the situation can change from one moment to the other. And for that one, I actually used a map that you cannot find in a bookshop, the country of the others. For that one, I had to use a map that is being kept updated by a group of cartographers, of map makers, commissioned by the United Nations, whose job is to basically keep updated the map of the West Bank and Gaza. So the map itself is not changes. It is subject to changes throughout the time. I made it in 2009, and I have regularly a look at how the map looks like, and it has changed since then. It already changed. So even what you were referring to as that very specific temporality that is involved in the project, for that one, it's even incorporated into the map itself. It changes. But what didn't change is his own trajectories in the meantime. Yeah.
Bouchra, the two clips that we have seen have male protagonists, right? And we know, and so I want to ask you about those journeys where you have women talking about the experience. I saw it in Colombia myself, and how the nature of the journey is different. The nature of the experience is different. And since you talk about the metonymy of the process, it seems to me that the affective narrative, when we see it in a gendered way, might actually be an interesting supplement to what we've seen. When the refugee, in your experience, though the protagonist refugee has been a woman, how has the aesthetic, ethical, affective construction of the work changed? Or is gender not an issue in this particular sense in which I'm posing it?
Well, there is indeed one, which protagonist is a young woman from Somalia. So you can say that for her case, she's fleeing a war, obviously. But similarly to many others of the same series, it's also about those temporary solidarities that you develop in specific locations. And in her case, it's exactly what happened. She traveled with a group of men, but those men also protected her. So she became part of a larger group who basically went from Somalia to southern Italy together. And they decided to go through this as a group standing in solidarity, which members stand in solidarity with each other. And it's something she emphasizes in the video. But at the same time, she also speaks about her and how she went through it. So maybe the question of gender can be relevant for this project, but I won't say that it's prominent on the other side, at least for what I have seen, and concerning the persons I have met throughout the 4 years during which I worked on this project.
Well, let me just conclude this and we can move on to the second.
But of course, there are other experiences.
Yes, of course.
Because there are also women who are raped.
Yeah, right.
There are also women who are kidnapped.
Women who lose their children.
Yeah, and women who are sex trafficked as well.
Yes.
But it was not the case for the women I met.
Right, but that's the issue I just wanted to bring up here, is the woman as the protagonist or the child as a protagonist. And I think one of the great values of these works is that very often people think that the refugee is a short-term status. As a refugee, it's a short-term thing. That's the way it was originally conceived, that then you would get asylum and then you could apply for citizenship. But I think by focusing so much on the journey, we begin to see the temporalities and the figurative lives and the experiences that make, as you said, the refugee as a site for a new kind of solidary community, a community of solidarity. It gives it a certain permanence, which is what we're seeing, I think, politically, even now. So the category is not just a passing status very often. It's something that people inhabit and build their lives around for a long time.
I want to come back to one point you made that I think is worth expanding on. That's the idea of the witness. That you position yourself as a witness, but you're more than a witness, right? You're also a researcher. You're not neutral in what you witness. And it seems to me that this project makes us, viewers, party to being a witness. And there's an underlying political call to action, I would think, in investing us with what you know, turning us into a witness. So how are we to react to this? In other words, what are we to do, having been witness to these journeys?
Well, when I defined myself as a witness, I was actually referring to the girl I was in the 90s, who was a witness of different things, and those things remained in my mind until now. Of course, when I started producing artworks, I was not a witness anymore. I was often a listener, because the whole process was also very much about very long conversation. And my position in those conversations was mostly the conversation of the listener, and the one who was asking only a few questions. But that was maybe the condition under which they could take possession of their own words and deliver those words in a very precise, factual, detailed way. Now, if I try to define your position as a viewer, my point is not about convincing you that the world should be a place with no borders, but rather to try to elaborate another perspective from which things can be seen and approached and possibly understood, hopefully. But it's like a bet. I bet on the viewer to make that engagement, to sit, to watch, to listen, and to reflect on it. I had the privilege to collaborate with you on an exhibition project. And I remember that we had that conversation around the idea that an exhibition space can also be a civic space. And when I work on projects, that's also what I hope for, that when installing an exhibition and welcoming an audience, we can also welcome an audience in a space that is not only an exhibition space, but also a civic space where encounters can happen among different people and where equality can be possible. So that's also the reason why in many of my works in video, there is this very specific precision in which the words are delivered. Because it's not about entertaining an audience or exhibiting something spectacular that would impress the audience. It's rather about creating a space where those words can be heard and those people can be met. So and then my position becomes the position of someone who tries to accommodate that space for encounter, and that space for equal relationship between the viewer and the individuals who actually tell their stories and try to bring another perspective into the conversation. I would say that's part of my job.
I think we can actually continue this into the next set of clips, because I think what you've said here in response to Glenn is how you do not want a sentimental identification. You do not want simply a sympathy to emerge. You want a reflective, even an alienation of some kind, that you now, you can't pretend that you are in that place. You are always confronting your own alterity, your own outsideness, and that's important for it. In the works that you're going to show now, the speaking, the series, I think what's interesting here is the complication of the notion of the witness. Here are speakers who are reading texts written by others, right? Is that right in the ones you're showing there?
Or the first one.
The first one. And then you are witnessing this double witnessing. The person who's speaking, a text of another in a particular context, and then you are actually making the work. So it might be useful for the first one just to tell us who the speaker is, what the text is, and your own position. And then we can just show it.
Yeah. Well, the first one
you will see.
Yeah, is actually the first one of the trilogy. The trilogy is called the Speeches series, and the first one is entitled Mother Tongue, and each of them has its own title. Mother Tongue for the first one, Words on Streets for the second, and Living Labor for the third. And the idea around the trilogy was to actually invite 5 individuals from different backgrounds, most of them being migrant in the West. So the series starts in Paris. Mother Tongues was filmed in Paris and in the banlieue, in the suburbs. Most of it was filmed in the suburb. The second in Genoa, Italy, for a specific reason, but I'm not showing an excerpt of that, so I won't enter into the detail of it and not explaining why Genoa and not another place in Italy. And the third, Living Labor, which excerpt we will see, was filmed in New York. And each of them focuses on a specific question. The first one is about language. What language do you speak in a situation of self-empowerment? What is the language of that? The second one is about citizenship. How can we redefine the question of citizenship from the perspective of individuals who are denied the status of being citizen? And the third one is a sort of synthesis of the two first, because it articulates the question of language, citizenship, via the question of labor and equality of rights at work. But the series is also articulated through a sort of progressive shift. Indeed, the first one started with a selection of, let's say, seminal texts and poems from the colonial period. I would say major pieces on emancipation and decolonization. And I collaborated with 5 different individuals, each of them choosing one text that they considered mirrored or reflected their own position. And then it was about translating those pieces into their mother tongue, because just as me, they are native speaker of unwritten language. My mother tongue, one of my mother tongues is Moroccan Arabic. Moroccan Arabic is considered as a dialect; it's not considered as a language. And one of the videos of the first film is actually in Moroccan Arabic, and it was a very interesting experience because we. With Nawel, who is performing the piece by Aimé Césaire. It's a fragments of the discourse on colonialism. We translated it together in Moroccan Arabic. And it was almost a sort of, it was a very bizarre experience to suddenly make the decision to translate this beautiful piece that is almost a poem into a language that was described in Morocco as a language that could not reflect such a complexity and beauty, because it's the language that is being spoken on the street. And Nawel, who is a wonderful speaker of classical Arabic, it was a very intense experience for her, because she really had the feeling that we were doing something that we shouldn't do. We shouldn't do that. But we did, and she told me something quite beautiful at the end. She told me, I never thought that our poor dialect could say such beautiful words.
Lovely.
So
Welcome.
It was really a beautiful experience. And the excerpt we will see now is the one with Anzouman. Anzouman is from Mali. He speaks in Malinké, has spoken in Mali. And the first time we met, he told me immediately, do you have something by Malcolm X? And I told him, yeah, I have actually Malcolm X's last speech.
Malcolm X's last speech.
Yeah. The one in which he announced the creation of the organization of African American and African Solidarity, if I remember well the name, but maybe someone in the audience will correct me, because I think I'm forgetting exactly the name of that organization. However, the first question he asked me was that, I want a piece by Malcolm X. And for a very good reason, because Anzouman was undocumented actually until recently. But he was for 10 years a very dedicated activist, a member of the collectif, 9e collectif de sans-papiers, a group advocating for equal rights at work, and specifically for the work permit for undocumented workers. It was his own position, but he was also an activist advocating for that. So for him, Malcolm X, even if he was born in Mali, raised in Mali, educated in Mali, then went to the West as a migrant, it was still a major inspiration for the struggle he was conducting. And that's basically the reason why he asked me immediately, give me something by Malcolm X, because I want to see those words. And as with Nawel, it was about translating the piece by Malcolm X in Malinké, and then each of them memorized by heart each piece and delivered them for the camera. Or at work, and we will see on Zuman basically sitting in the open air market where he works, very early in the morning and in the afternoon, cleaning up the open air market. And he's sitting there, and that's where he delivers the words by Malcolm X in his own mother tongue. And after that, we will see Living Labor that somehow mirrors the first film of the series, because in that one, the words were written by each of the participants. It's their own speech. They are not quoting anymore. There's a sort of shift from appropriation to authorship. However, it doesn't mean that they don't respond to each other, that their own experiences don't respond or echo what was written decades before, when people from what was called at that time the Third World were uprising and struggling for their emancipation and independence.
I think that's wonderful. In a way, translation is also a kind of authorship.
It is, I believe.
It is, yes. Okay, so let's have those two, please. Thank you. You very subtly displace the documentary traditions with what you earlier called the metonymic presence. So it's not the person as a character as much as the body as representing an experience, the experience of labor, the experience of migration. That's where you see the metonymy of the hands, and I think that's extraordinarily effective. Or even that magic marker, the way it keeps the hand flutters. I think you really capture something about time, labor, and identification as citizen or non-citizen, as undocumented. It's almost as if the person becomes a process, which is very difficult to do, and I think very effective.
I mean, the two things that strike me that come through here, and I'm interested in how you get at that, is empathy and dignity. Right? It seems to me those are the substrata of these conversations, the emphatic and the empathetic, in the notion of dignity in the face of extreme conditions and oppression. So talk a little bit about how you meet these people. Where do they come from? How do you engage them?
As you said, we met. So they were not casted. And when I work on a project, because as you know, I never work with professional performers. I never did that, and but they are not casted, because when I work on something, I don't say, okay, I want someone from Afghanistan, or it doesn't work that way at all. It relies on a very long process, spending time somewhere. I must say for Paris at that time, it was not really difficult because I lived there. And the 9e collectif pour la régularisation des sans-papiers was often demonstrating under my windows in Paris. It's mostly about spending time somewhere. And then you start meeting people. It's a very natural process. Of course, one has to be lucky in a way, but I think anyone can deliver those words in this way. Like it's just about giving the platform to do it. It's not about looking good at the camera or whatever, and that's why I don't believe in casting, and I just never do it. I find it as complete contradiction of what I try to do. So to answer your question, I would say it's mostly a combination of spending time and being lucky, because it happens, and it happens often by chance, but yeah, in a very simple way.
So you end up with 5 individuals. Do you actually shoot more than 5, or
no.
do you know at the get-go that these are? And do you have in your mind the cinematic construction? I mean, clearly the movement from the voice, but not the presence of the person, then his presence, and then the detail of the hands. Is that already structured in your mind when you begin?
Well, I mean, you know quite well my work, so you know that I like static shots, quite long, a certain type of editing, and indeed often I have already in mind the whole structure. So the shooting in itself is quite fast, but it's also important because then the participants in the project know the montage as well, they know the editing. They also know that their words won't be manipulated afterwards in the editing room. So they have a clear sense of the continuity of the whole thing because it is shot chronologically, one shot after the other, and they know exactly what is the shot coming next. So it's about, for myself, preparing, but also to make sure that they understand precisely the logic of it and the continuity of it. Then they can be also involved in the editing process in some way, because they know how the cutting is made.
Do you know, I think this brings us back to where we started, and then I would like to open up to questions to you both, which is that if the freedom of movement, you know, the right to movement is at the heart of freedom, then dignity is our ability to respect the choices that people make to move without judging them a priori. Dignity is to allow somebody to make the choice to change their life. This is Avishai Margalit's very interesting notion of dignity. You know, it's not inherent in you, it's a particular form of agency. And I think that's what these works have, if you accept it, have really articulated in so many different ways. This, to go back to you again, this dignity of witnessing somebody make a choice to change their lives for various reasons, one way or another. I want to thank you both very much for this conversation, and let's open up. So a hand for you both first. So now that you've given them a hand, I want to see a show of hands. Yes. Please, your name. Yes, 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 yes. Greg. Yes, 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 yes. Yes.
Hi. Thank you very much for this discussion. It's been incredible. My name is Adira Nicolau. I'm a comparative literature PhD student here, and I also study critical media practice. My question or comment, and it's something that I look at in my work as well, that examines narratives of migration in the Mediterranean. It's about how, so these bodies that are traveling and are in transit, they come into relationships with other bodies or spaces that are not defined by a sense of choice in what we're usually accustomed to as choice in a non-transit environment. A lot of it is defined by accident. A lot of it is defined by what I call it contiguity, basically, that raises the notion of contingency in these lives. So
Ask the question, please.
Yes, the question is, thank you. The question is basically, what do you think the role of accident and haphazardness and that sort of, that as a way of framing these narratives, how does that play in your work or in the narratives that you sort of use in your work?
Thank you very much. Should we take a couple of questions and then we can? Yes, then the other, yes, here and then, yeah, here. Let's take these, yeah.
Okay, my name is Cynthia Becker. I'm a professor of African art history at Boston University. And I first saw your work at the Tropen Museum, and the Tropen Museum in Amsterdam.
I am.
It really touched me a lot, so I really love it. And I work a lot in Morocco, and I know that in Morocco there are many similar discussions about migration of sub-Saharan Africans and issues of racism and the difficulties that they're experiencing. So I'm wondering, are you doing a project maybe in the future focusing on Morocco, or have you shown your work in Morocco itself?
Thank you very much. Let's take these two more. Yeah. Thank you for making your question, directly to the work. Thank you. Yeah.
Bouchra, thank you so much for sharing your work with us. My name is Harsha. I'm a graduate of the Divinity School, and now I'm in an MFA program. I wanted to ask you about your installation process and how you went from physically recording to installation. And I'm thinking specifically of something that Frederick Wiseman once said, that actually he called his filming his research process. It's actually the editing where you can sort of start to see. So if you could talk about that, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Good question. Thank you very much. Yeah. One here, right in front here.
Thank you very much. My name is Mariano Siskin. I'm a professor of Romance, Languages, and Literatures, and I'm a great admirer of your work, and I came to your work through the Mapping Journey project, and I wanted to ask you about that. So the inscription of the migrants' trajectories in the map in the face of the loss of home and the loss of land. Do you read your own work as a way of tracing loss, or as a way of regaining a territory or regaining something in the face of loss? In other words, is it a work about the mourning of a loss, or is it a work about the hopeful regaining of something that perhaps cannot be recuperated, but there's say the tracing of the desire and the willingness to reinscribe oneself in the world after the loss?
Thank you.
I'm very bad at taking notes. I should have listened.
Or we can all kind of, remind you.
Do you mind if I answer first the second question?
Yeah.
Yes, so some of them have been shown in Morocco. And I actually did works in Morocco afterwards, one of them being entitled Garden Conversation. And it's about a very specific story that I was told when I was a kid in Morocco, because at that time the name of Abdel Karim al-Khattabi could not be mentioned in public, but it stayed in my mind for many years. And that one was actually shot in Morocco and Melilla, literally at the border between the two. I don't know if you are familiar with the geography of northern Morocco, but Melilla is a Spanish enclave in northern Morocco, as Ceuta, who are actually Spanish territories. So there are two pieces of European Union in North Africa. And that piece is actually about the secret meeting of Abdel Karim al-Khattabi and Ernesto Guevara in Cairo in '59. I don't know if you know who is Abdel Karim al-Khattabi. He's Al-Khattabi, the precursor of anti-colonial movements. So to answer your question, yes, I did go back to Morocco. I make works there, and specifically that one. But I don't know if that one can be shown there now. I don't know. I was not invited to show it. But there were some of my works who were indeed shown in Morocco. Am I answering your question? I think I did. Yeah. Well, they are extremely attentive when they watch them, and I had the same experience in Mali, in Bamako. It was really impressive to witness the viewers, because they were discussing the works on the site. So the exhibition space became a space for conversation among the viewers. And it happened in many different places, I must say, even at MoMA, where I could witness exactly the same thing. And that was in New York. But there were many members of the audience who were from Ghana. I remember meeting people from Ghana, Morocco, Syria, who actually went to the museum and spent some time with the installation, and they were discussing it there.
Can I interject one element, because it also perhaps connects to one of the other questions? What I thought was so remarkable well, it was true for the new museum as well, although to a lesser degree when Mapping Journey was shown there. But this notion of a civic space where people came to watch the different journeys that they chose to watch, but began conversations with each other, total strangers, talking about each of these journeys and what it meant. And that idea of civic space as an active, viable, engaged space where we can, in a way, forge some form of common language, common empathy, struck me as one of the more remarkable aspects of the project itself, that somehow it elicited from utter strangers, whether they were European, American, or from North Africa, or wherever they were from, this ability to talk to each other and query what they were seeing. And so I wonder, if you would elaborate a little bit on how you think about installation and how does one create that civic space?
Thank you, because I was about to answer the third question about installation. I must be very lucky because I had this experience in different museums and for different works. As an example, this image is from a project called Foreign Office, and that one is about the decade during which Algiers became the Mecca of revolutionaries, to quote Amilcar Cabral's words. And it was shown for the first time at Palais de Tokyo in Paris. And exactly what you were describing about the installation in MoMA happened at Palais de Tokyo. It happened first with the museum guards, because most of them are from Algeria, Kabyle more specifically, and others are from sub-Saharan Africa, and they were many times coming and looking at what I was doing, because they started hearing the video playing, and then they started seeing pictures being installed and hanged, and they were regularly during the day coming and asking questions. What are you showing exactly? And then when it was done, and I came back on that next day, they were watching it. And I was extremely happy that they were watching the film finally installed. And they told me something absolutely beautiful. They told me this is maybe the first time in a museum where our story is told. Because most of them, as I was telling you, were from Algeria or sub-Saharan Africa. So maybe the reason why this often happens when I have an exhibition somewhere, it's because those stories belongs to somehow my own story and the story I was told when I was a kid in Morocco and what I have witnessed myself. But I'm not the only one who is concerned by this. We are millions. And I just decided to work with it. So to answer more specifically your question, when I start installing a work, I often refer to the exhibition space as much as a civic space, as an editing room, in salle de montage, because it's also about combining different fragments that do not aim to achieve a picture. And I don't want to achieve the picture, because then it means that there's no space for the people who will attend the space and spend time with it. So it's also a sort of dialogue between the work and all the people, many different people who will go there and do somehow part of the job. Because there is one way to approach the work, but there are also others. And part of my job is also to allow that, to have different ways to approach it. Of course, I'm very much responsible to make it functional first, but most importantly, to allow that navigation within it. And then you can find your own way. But what I refuse is that authoritarian position of the artist who impose the experience of an artwork. If that answers your question. And I will answer yours. It's a beautiful and a very difficult question to answer. I can answer talking about myself first. I left Morocco many years ago now. I often go back, but I know that Morocco is lost for me in a way, because I don't live there anymore. But I also know that it will be my home for the rest of my life, until the very last day. Is it mourning? I'm not sure. For myself, it became a sort of critical position, in a way. Of course, I cannot speak for all those people who collaborated to my project. I cannot tell what is their position. What I can tell you is that when we produced all those works, or at least the few of them that you saw today, what we agreed on, or let's say what we shared, is this common will for equality. So if there is a mourning, maybe there is a mourning for the loss of equality, or for an equality that must come into being and that doesn't exist yet. You're welcome. Can you tell me what was...
Contingency, the question of accident, contingency.
Yes. Yes, it plays a major role. I mean, yeah, accident plays a major role, but what is, I think, extraordinary with all those people I met with those projects was how they were able to find a response to that. As I was telling before, it's a very difficult life. It becomes a life. We were referring to the specific temporality of it. In one of the videos, it took 5 years. In another, 10 years. But in between, you have to find a place where you can stay, at least for a few months or maybe a year or two, find a job. Often, even finding a job is somehow a sort of accident. And then you lose the job, also often accidentally. Or because you were arrested, then you were jailed in the retention center, and then you are finally released, etc., etc. So it's what I find absolutely, what I admire the most is the sense of resilience and the spirit of resistance. So when I was telling you that equality is also very much at stake, resistance is also very much at stake. And of course, contingency and the accidental aspect of it is indeed part of it, but maybe more importantly, the question is how do you respond to it?
Thank you. Any further questions? Yes, please.
First of all, congrats on the job you've done. I'm actually more interested, a lot of the things you touch on, I think I can relate in a way, and I think it's kind of very difficult for someone to really understand unless, of course, they're pretty much in your shoes or pretty much look like you.
Just have to speak up a bit. Just hold the mic a little bit closer.
Okay. So I think what I'm more interested in, I think these kinds of documentaries provide sort of lofty presentations for like academic conversations for people. You still can hear me?
It's sort of muffled, so speak up about that.
So what I'm interested in, I think it's great that we do these kinds of documentaries because they provide what I like to call sort of, you know, edible fruit for, you know, people like us that are maybe slightly more like privileged to be able to have conversations about people that are pretty much on the peripheries of society. But what I'm more interested in is the extent to which, you know, your documentaries provide an avenue for more intervention, and also like what are some of the mechanisms maybe you put in place to make sure that these things are like making a compelling case for why there's a need for intervention, because and also like how some of these like over the long pool change the narrative about sort of the perceptions we have about like, maybe immigrants and things of the sort. Because there was a critical case where I was in Switzerland in 2011, and at the train station I was just visiting. I was a student at Columbia at the time, and someone walked up to me and said, "Hey, would you have marijuana? I'm looking to buy some marijuana." And I said, I don't know. And so when I inquired, I realized that that's like a prevailing perception, and because those immigrants who make it there have no access to like jobs and things of the sort. So they're one way or the other compelled to fall on some of those means of sustenance, which is not I wouldn't say as a true reflection of who they actually are, but because they've been put in situations that allowed them to not have access to maybe the, you know, like some of the opportunities that maybe being a citizen or people of the sort might be able to have. They're compelled to take detours that one way or the other shapes a perception about their group. So I'm more interested in like over the long pool, what does this do aside from like we coming together and having lofty conversations about immigrants and the crossing and things of the sort. Because at the end of the day, the rhetoric has been around for so many like decades, and if we continue on that trajectory, that's not going to provide.
Thank you very much, brother. Thank you. Yeah. Do you want to answer that question? How does this work? Make an intervention? Does it allow people to campaign for transformation? Or is it something that works within its own realm, the realm of art, the realm of education? I think that's the purpose of this question.
Yeah, I think you're right. But maybe I can be more specific. I'm not an activist, and I have chosen the space of art to raise a conversation. You can find it not the most effective space to change a situation, but it is also a space where things can be discussed and things can happen. I can give you an example. My first vocation or my first interest in art was not in contemporary art or in visual art, it was in film. And what influenced the most my work and myself as a person was a certain history of cinema. The one that belongs to, let's say, the 60s and 70s, and from the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, Brazil, or Italy after World War II. But I decided to go to contemporary art for basically two reasons. First, because it was a space that was more free. Because if I would have made the decision to become a filmmaker, I would have to stick to a specific format, to a formula, to a way of narrating stories. And I'm not a documentary filmmaker, because even in documentary filmmaking, there are formulas to follow if you want to work to be shown. In art, I could basically do the things the way I wanted them to be done and the way I wanted them to be shown. So now to go back more specifically to your question. Those works are shown in museums, but they are also shown, even if I'm not an activist and don't consider myself as an activist, they are also shown among activists who ask me if they can show them, and they do. So the question is, or rather, the question is not what would be the most appropriated space or the most effective space for this work, but rather who is ready to engage in a conversation with those works. And from that moment, they can be shown in many different spaces. And that's what basically often happens.
Thank you. We have a last question there, because we've got to close down in 4 minutes.
Thank you. This has been such a fascinating discussion. Thank you. I'm Jonathan Geyer. I'm a colleague of Bouchra's at the Radcliffe Institute. And in my experience in the Maghreb in Morocco has been one of incredible hospitality and one I'm really grateful for. And I noticed in the excerpts we saw sort of the opposite, the anti-hospitality of Europe. Can you discuss that notion of hospitality? And of course, there's a rich tradition in the Maghreb and Morocco of it, and how sort of migrants or refugees have encountered the opposite.
I'm answering all the questions.
Because they're asking you all the questions. So we are the kind of support band here, you know. So.
I will answer your question, and then, because you also asked me a question that I didn't answer when I answered you. Yes, there is an extraordinary tradition of hospitality in North Africa and in the Middle East. It is true. It is part of the tradition there. And Westerners often benefit from it. They love going to Morocco. But I don't believe that, as an example, sub-Saharan Africans have the same experience. I actually don't believe it at all, and I know it's not true. However, it is changing, because I have also noticed that there are more and more sort of public debate around these questions, and there's even something new that happened. Many were given residency permits. But this is completely new. I mean, I remember 10 years in the late 90s, early 2000, where they were living in the old Medina, in completely hidden places, and they were completely marginalized. And that was really a shame, a big, big shame. But the same way that the conversation around the fact that many young men were willing to go out from the country took years before it became a public conversation in Morocco. It took almost 10 years, because it was somehow the proof that Moroccans were not happy in their home country. It was not at war. They were not starving. However, many thousands, dozens of thousands were ready to risk their lives to go abroad. And that meant something. And that's exactly what the society didn't want to discuss for at least a decade. So the question of hospitality, again, maybe, I mean, to me, it makes more sense somehow to discuss it in terms of equality. And when in the works the question of citizenship is discussed, it is never discussed from the perspective of the power somehow, like that delivers legal papers, because it shouldn't be the only definition of who is a citizen and who is not. There are many other alternative ways to define who is a citizen, and why should it be by exclusion, because it is often defined through exclusion. Those and those and those are excluded from citizenship. So in principle, I agree, Europe is not a place where hospitality is a common value. But maybe because citizenship is still considered as a privilege. After years in France, I became myself a French citizen. But I don't believe that I'm an equal citizen, because I'm from North Africa, and because in that country I'm still regarded as an Arab. You were talking before about the consequences. Can't remember how you phrased it exactly, because it was really beautiful. But let me give you an example. In France now, they are discussing the constitutionalization of the state of emergency. And with the incorporation of the state of emergency into the French constitution, there is also an institutionalization and a legalization of racial profiling. So French police is given a total permission to check IDs on streets. And they won't be, I mean, they are absolutely free to do it, including with racial profiling. Who will be targeted? French citizens too. But the excuse they use is, yeah, but we have to, I mean, there are too many illegal migrants in France, and we cannot welcome all those people. So legally, we have the right to arrest them, to put them in jail for 30 days, but now they want to expand it to 60, and to deport them. But the way they phrase it, and the way they approach it, automatically targets French citizens as well. But to them, it doesn't matter, because they are not really French citizens in a way. You see what I mean? So it's beyond the question of hospitality. It's also, I think, absolutely about how you conceive civic belonging, citizenship. Does it make sense?
It makes good sense. What about you? Do you want to say a few words about hospitality, being as you are an extremely hospitable person in all kinds of ways, and I can attest to that?
I don't know if I can add much on the subject of hospitality, but I do think this issue of how Europe is being reconfigured by both first and second, and even to a certain degree, third generation immigrants, largely from North Africa and elsewhere in the Muslim world, makes one have to understand the idea of belonging in a very different way, right? It's easy enough when one talks only about those illegal immigrants who've just crossed over. But that's different from the populations that actually also exist in Europe and that all get lumped together. And I think what we're seeing, and this is what was so prescient about the Mapping Journey project, is what we're seeing is a kind of reformation, you might even call it a deformation, of the idea of Europe itself as it is being reshaped by new populations that actually operate with a very different set of rules, often invisibly, until suddenly one issue or another forces them to the surface. So the issue of hospitality in this context, I think, has to also be understood in a way that looks at how any notion of Europe has to be rebalanced by a new notion that Europe is as much a part of the Middle East today as those places in the Middle East themselves define themselves, right? There's this deterritorialization that Olivier Roy and others talk about that I think creates a fascinating subject that is only beginning to be understood. And that means that the migrant, and again, it's always, isn't just the migrant anymore. He or she is actually a participant in a larger geography, perhaps, than we even understand ourselves today.
So, according to current statistics, as I recall, the world population of migrants is just more or less the same as Great Britain.
65 million.
Yeah, more or less Sorry, 45.
65.
I beg your pardon? Yes, that's right. So the question of hospitality, I think I just want to end, if I might just draw this to a close, by saying that, you know, I think one of the great concepts of the right to hospitality is with Immanuel Kant. And what Kant says in the right to hospitality is that every person whose life is endangered has a right to hospitality. You have to take them in unconditionally. But once you allow them in and save their lives and protect them, then all other processes take place. Then they don't just have a right to stay. Then you've got to go through the whole legal process. This is Kant. Now, I think what is important and what we don't do enough of is understand that the very nature of hospitality, of being the host, is also a moment of hostility. So that there will always on the threshold be a sense of threat, a sense of fear, and a sense of welcome. And it's how institutions, educational institutions, governmental institutions, work with that problem that I think is the issue. That neighborliness is always a mutual problem. You're never a neighbor on your own. And if neighborliness is part of hospitality, it's a relational issue. But I think that we have to understand all the negative emotions that people feel, the sense of territoriality, the sense of being, in a way, imposed upon. I think if we don't understand those notions of anxiety and fear on the part of those who seek a refuge, who are also deeply anxious. I mean, they didn't choose to leave their homes. They're deeply anxious. They're deeply traumatized. You've got to understand that trauma, but you also have to understand the other trauma of alterity. And unfortunately, because the whole question of political affect is drained from our language of political rationality. We are good at political virtue. We are not good at political anxiety. It's for that reason that I think the question of hospitality has really never become a dominant political and ethical issue. It has remained in the realm of the philosophical. But as Kant says, the problem about not embracing your neighbor, the idea comes less from the critiques, but more from his work on geography, is that the circumference of the world is round. If I start from here and you start from there, we will meet each other. He literally says that the spherical or the circumference of the earth does not allow you not to be hospitable. Now that's, of course, a metaphor for something much larger about encounter. But we've got to understand that that encounter will be fraught and difficult, and we've got to courageously and with resilience deal with it. And that's why James Baldwin's central issue about how to get rid of segregation is that we need what he calls an ironic resilience. An ironic resilience. And I think that that is extremely important. It goes back to our friend here about resistance. What are sites of resistance? Sites of resistance are where you happen to be and are most effective. That does not mean that on the factory floor is necessarily more important than in the academy where you're training new minds, or in the school system. So I think the issue of getting rid of that stereotype, the way that you were confronted, that because you were a man of color, you would be selling marijuana and you wouldn't be a student at Columbia. To break the stereotype is to take every moment where you are and try and actually raise these significant questions. I want to thank you all for being with us today. I want to thank the two of you in particular, Bouchra, for your wonderful sharing of your work in the most open-hearted and open-minded way. Thank you. Glenn, for coming from New York and helping us frame this discussion and bringing your very rare insights of practice and of principle to bear. I want to thank the audience for the many interesting questions. I want to apologize for holding court at the end by talking about my ideas on hospitality, but I do want to ask you to return again and come to things which you think you may not be interested in. We need to make new constituencies, and we need to make new friends and new neighbors. Thank you very much.